Linda is an award-winning civil rights activist, community organizer, and mother of three. A Palestinian Muslim American born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, she's the former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York and the co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, MPower Change. She's also a founding member of Justice League NYC, a leading force of activists, artists, youth, and formerly incarcerated individuals committed to criminal justice reform through direct action and policy advocacy. Sarsour served as national co-chair of the largest single-day protest in U.S. history, the Women's March on Washington. Named among 500 of the most influential Muslims in the world, she was also cited as one of Fortune's 50 greatest leaders and featured as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2017. She's won numerous awards for her activism, including a Champion of Change award from the Obama administration. She's a frequent media commentator on issues that affect Muslim communities, Middle East affairs, and criminal justice reform. She's most recognized for her transformative intersectional organizing work and movement building. Linda, it's an honor to have you here with us tonight. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for all of your good work. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited and honored to be here with all of you in this virtual space. I am very grateful to Booksmith and for USC and for the many people who I was supposed to be hanging out with in the Bay Area on March 31st, which is today. So instead of doing it in person, we are doing it via this Zoom link. And I'm so honored to be able to talk to you about my new book. This is my new book, and it's called We're Not Here to Be Bystanders, a memoir of love and resistance. And this is a very important book. I spent 2.5 years working on it, and I had no idea that my book would come out during a global pandemic, but will I have a lot of stories to tell my grandchildren. So I wanted to start out by just reading 2 excerpts from my book and then sharing with you why I wrote this book. And then I would love to take questions from all of you. And so I wanted to first share and read for you from the foreword of the book. And the foreword of the book is written by a mentor and a civil rights legend, an icon really, and someone who really put his money where his mouth is and was one of the stalwarts of the civil rights movement in this country. He was an entertainer, and he was an artist that used his platform for working on elevating the plight of Black people in America and really fighting for the civil rights of all people. And his name is Mr. Harry Belafonte. He just celebrated his birthday, his 93rd birthday, and I love him very much. And it was the greatest honor of my life for him to have written the foreword to my book. And so I would like to read you the foreword so that it hopefully will inspire you and also encourage you to read and also buy my book. So here is the foreword, a very short foreword that was written by Mr. Belafonte, called Purpose and Grace. As my good friend Martin once said, we've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. That quote spoken by Dr. King less than 24 hours before he was assassinated resonates with me deeply as I contemplate my affection for Linda Sarsour. I have been aware of this tremendous young woman for several years now. I find her to be bold and brilliant and unexpected, a combination of qualities that inspire me. When Linda first crossed my threshold, brought into my midst by Carmen Perez, who runs my social justice organization, The Gathering for Justice, I was immediately drawn to her. Quite the spitfire she was, unapologetic and strong. I saw in her a burning fire, and she drew me in. I watched her and her comrades shift the ground and make waves and stop the machine. I delighted in their tenacity, their bold vision for Black and brown liberation, and their radical approach to movement work. I'm no stranger to movement work. It is grueling and gut-wrenching and absolutely necessary. I was 25 years old when I met Martin and the folks of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Martin was 22. There was an undeniable urgency to his message, and his principles of nonviolence fueled the work. While we may not have made it to the promised land, my peers and I, my brothers and sisters in liberation, can rest easy knowing that the future is in the hands of leaders like Linda Sarsour. I have often said to Linda that she embodies the principle and purpose of another great Muslim leader, Brother Malcolm X, who said, if you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary. And that's another thing about movement work, the sacrifice, the personal assaults, the violence. It wasn't that long ago we lost Martin and Bobby. We lost so many more to assassins' bullets, to lynching. When I read the vitriolification directed at Linda and her sisters of the Women's March, I recognize the despair, the isolation, the fear. I also recognize the strength it takes to rise each new day and face an uncertain and dangerous world. We cannot allow the forces of oppression and evil to divide our precious movement. And we cannot sit idly by while these forces our history and co-opt our narratives of peace and justice and equity. We celebrate women like now and not allow the ravages of time to silence our sung praises. I may not make it to the promised land with you, but we will get there. I know this because I know Linda. I have witnessed her passion, commitment, and determination. This generation of activists and organizers, they're getting it right. They are building the beloved community with radical intention. And that's all I can hope for our world. How wonderful that you will have the opportunity to read this fine book and to experience Linda's grace. We are all richer. February 21st, 2019, New York City, Mr. Harry Belafonte. So that's the foreword of my book, and I'm so deeply honored. Every time I read it, it brings tears to my eyes, and I pray to God he protect Mr. Belafonte, give him health, and give him a long life on this earth so we can benefit from his wisdom. Another I wanted to read from my book started the first introduction with, what is your jihad? And people thought I was crazy. They were like, do you really want to start there? And the reason why I started with this question and the title of this introduction is, what is your jihad? Is because I told a story about one time, about 2 years ago, where I got in really big trouble for using that word at a Muslim convention. And it is a word that is very important. It's a very important Islamic concept. And I said it at an event. Some Islamophobes put it together, edited a video, put it out, and basically said I was calling to, for there to be a holy war against the president of the United States of America. I was trending on Twitter for like 2 days. I had multiple threats, physical threats, death threats. I mean, it was the most outrageous thing that I could imagine. I can't even tell you how outrageous it was. And what I did was, where it came from is I was sharing a story with a Muslim audience about our beloved Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, where a man once asked him, he said, what is the best form of jihad or struggle? Which is really the interpretation of the word jihad. And our beloved Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, responded and said that the best form of jihad or struggle is a word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. And that was really it. And everybody went home, everything was fine. And then the next day I'm trending on Twitter for 2 days and I was getting attacked, and every right-wing America came after me. The son of the president of the United States joined the conversation. It was pretty bad. So this is where this comes from. So in order for you to understand this part of the book that I want to read to you, that's the context. That story of jihad. Why am I telling you this story? Because it helps to explain why I decided to write this book. More than a memoir of my 3+ decades on this earth, my narrative is a social justice manifesto, a rallying cry for every one of us to step forward and serve our country, embracing its rich diversity with open arms, insisting that our leaders respect the rights of all its citizens while behaving morally in the world. In this book and in my life, I strive to follow the guidance that the beloved Prophet Muhammad laid out for us, to speak up for my people and for all people, to confront injustice in all its forms, and to challenge the dangerous misperceptions about who we are. In following this path, I refuse to be intimidated. I will not allow myself to be controlled by other people's fear of what they don't understand. For the sake of my own mental health, I try not to engage with all the hate and venom that comes at me. Sometimes I simply have to jump in to affirm that I am not ashamed or afraid to be who I am. Unapologetically Muslim American, unapologetically Palestinian American, and unapologetically from Brooklyn, New York. There are people who hate what I represent. I shatter every stereotype they have of Muslim women, whom they seem to believe should be submissive and subservient, unseen and unheard. I am seen everywhere. I make my voice a megaphone, speaking up for my people to those who would vilify and dehumanize us. I will not sit by and allow my people, your people, anyone's people to be vilified and dehumanized, because when hate goes uncontested for too long, atrocities happen, as the history of this very country has shown. And so I will keep organizing, building power, and speaking out against injustice, because that is my right and my charge. And because in the face of hate, it is the ultimate expression of love. I'm gonna skip a little bit. Now more than ever, we must resist the temptation to hide our light, bide our time, to make ourselves appear less formidable than we are. If you ever ask, should I not share the position I hold on this lightning rod issue? Should I shrink myself in certain rooms where my voice is not welcome? Always the answer is no. Should I appear less Palestinian, less Latina, less Black today? Always the answer is no. We must never negotiate away or compromise our principles and values. Instead, we must bring all our complex identities to the table, transforming those spaces in which any part of who we are is not welcome. Because our country's future and the world our children will inherit depends on our courage and commitment now. I want everyone who reads this book to walk away understanding that the path to change lies in building coalitions across marginalized communities, not just among Muslims, but also women and immigrants and the undocumented, Black Lives Matter advocates, supporters of LGBTQ rights, people with disabilities, the elderly, poor people, everyone struggling for equal treatment under the law. We must recognize that unity is not uniformity. Rather, it is the key to our very survival. If we are able to bring all oppressed communities together inside one tent, and bring all of our allies with us into that tent, our collective will vastly outnumber the opposition. Once we grasp that we are not actually outnumbered, we will no longer be out-organized by those who seek to divide us, by provoking tribal animosities. Instead, we will join together to become this nation's unshakable moral compass. Let us therefore stand shoulder to shoulder and keep our voices loud, remembering always that fear is a choice. And so is, we are the majority, and we must be the conscience of this country, its true north, knowing that when we resist injustice against any of us, we advance the cause of justice for all of us. Look around you, my sisters and brothers. We are each other's greatest hope, the beating heart of a nation. We are what democracy looks like. So that is the introduction, a little bit of the introduction of the book. And I just want to talk a little bit more about why I decided to write this book. For me, it was really about giving something back to my community, giving them a story of resilience, a story of victory. This is not a book about being a victim. In fact, there's a lot of winning in my book. A lot of organizing, a lot of inspirational stories. And it was an opportunity to also be able to express myself as an individual. Sometimes we see activists and organizers and we think of them oftentimes almost as not human. And, you know, I am a mom, I have children, have a family, I have aspirations and dreams of my own, and I fight every single day against injustice. And I wanted people to hear me and listen to my story because I've been defined by everybody else. And it was time for me to define myself. And my story is not just my story, but it gives you a window into living as a Muslim American in this country, particularly for those of us who have had to experience and endure the kind of post 9/11 America. And I hope that that you all get to see into the hearts and into the minds and the experiences of people who pray like me and come from the communities that I come from. This book is what I say to folks right now is like the book came at the right time. The title of the book, We Are Not Here to Be Bystanders, really speaks to the moment that we're in right now. And, you know, I was going to spend 2.5 years writing a book and having it come out during a global pandemic. But then I say, maybe there's a reason for this. And, you know, this idea of we are not here to be bystanders is really a action for all of us. You know, we still have an election this year. We still have children in cages at the border. We still have people who are homeless in our country. We still have people living in poverty in our country. We still have documented immigrants. And so for me, we still have, you know, refugees and LGBTQ people and so many people that every single day are fighting for equal treatment under the law. So we have to make a decision as individuals never to be bystanders. And I have made a commitment every single day that when I wake up, I make that intention every day that I'm not a bystander. I will never be a bystander, and I will never be silent in the face of injustice. And so I hope this book inspires you and also makes folks realize that, you know, there's really nothing extraordinary about me. I'm a mom. I'm a product of the New York City public school system. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and anyone can make a decision to say, I'm not going to sit by, I'm going to organize, I'm going to build power, I'm going to build relationships. And this book is about a lot of anecdotes and stories that will really touch you and move you. So many folks have sent me messages telling me I cried. You know, I needed this book at this time. So I hope that folks really get a hold of this book, support your local bookstores, or find a way to get the book and read it. So I'm going to start answering some questions, just because I think it's important to engage folks, and especially folks who read the book or have any questions about the book. So we have a question from Elaf that says, halfway through the book and couldn't help but notice how lucky you were to be surrounded by such supportive parents in the community. I'm curious, have you ever received any criticism within the Muslim community for being outspoken, taking charge? And if so, how did you navigate it? Elaf, I absolutely have received criticism from within my own community. You know, the Muslim American community is not exclusive to patriarchy. It's not exclusive to misogyny. And so for me, as a young Muslim American woman, I started doing this work in my very early 20s. You know, I was loud. I was from Brooklyn. I was from Palestinian. I wanted to take charge. I was so passionate after the horrific attacks of 9/11 to defend my community after I saw, and you will read more about it in my book, on the things that many Muslim Americans endured after the horrific attacks of 9/11, that I did get pushback. And so for me, I really wanted to shatter some ceilings. And I think I did a lot of shattering of ceilings and of walls in our community for other young women organizers. And the way that I navigated is there's a great saying that I hear folks say all the time: if they can't beat you, they join you. And eventually what I did was I started creating my own spaces. I started doing my own organizing work. I started being an impactful organizer. I started bringing people to the table. I started mobilizing women in my community. And that really forced leadership in our community to look at me and say, listen, this woman's bringing something to the table. She may be a little loud, but you know, we're gonna figure this out. And so I have done this work for 20 years now, and have navigated a lot of spaces that many women have to navigate. I've had to work harder than some of my male kids to be seen and to be respected. But at the end of the day, it's been worth it for me to help build the path for future organizers. And many of the organizers who I organize with right now who are younger than I and before them. Robert asked a great question. Thank you so much, Robert, for getting my book and reading it. The thoughts on intersectionality of movements that might not always agree. And, you know, we're actually in a dilemma right now around this issue. And I think it's important that we really have this discussion about intersectionality, and for folks to understand that intersectionality has a very specific meaning, and the meaning and the term comes from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black woman scholar who really put forth this theory that oppression works at the intersections, and that we can't talk about racial justice without talking about gender justice and economic justice and environmental justice, etc. And so for me, what happens is where sometimes we don't always agree, but we can still organize in an intersectional movement. For example, when you're organizing around an issue of criminal justice reform, there are people in our criminal justice reform movement who are abolitionists. They believe in the absolute dismantling and deletion of prisons and police. There are some people in the criminal justice reform movement who are not there yet. But there have been ways where we have been able to find intersections and common ground to work on issues in the moment, while people may not necessarily agree on all the issues. Even when we talk about, for example, March is a great example of intersectionality gone wrong. This was a movement of women who rose up after the inauguration of Donald Trump, or after the post Donald Trump election. And women who were outraged that this country, elected a, sexist, misogynist, racist, et cetera, and couldn't quite grasp this idea that these things that people were outraged about had all long existed before there was ever a Donald Trump. I mean, we've had sexism, misogyny, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism way before there was ever a Donald Trump. And then being able to have a movement where people understand that our issues intersect. Criminal justice reform intersects with racial justice. It intersects with immigration. It intersects on so many levels, on so many issues, and not being able to get people to just not work in silos and figuring out how we can bring multiple people to the table with multiple issues and multiple identities and build power that way. And it's a concept that the progressive left hasn't been able to figure out. And even up until now, as we're watching this election unfold, we are watching the lack of intersectionality. And we are watching, us not being able to build the type of power across the different movements at one time. And so I'm still in it. I still believe in intersectionality. I believe in it as a power building theory, but I don't think we're there, and we have a lot of work to do. So Dammit is asking, what was the hardest part of the book to write? I think the hardest part is really sharing a lot of the stories that I shared about, the way that my work has impacted my family and my children in particular. I think that really means, it was hard for me to kind of go back to those moments. They were very deep moments. Really hurt me and broke my heart on many levels. But I wanted to share them with the world and to kind of get people to understand the sacrifices that many women of color, particularly those of us with families, have to make in order to do this work, in this movement. Michelle, thank you, is asking, Angela Davis said, it is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. In Freedom is a Constant Struggle, which is a great book that everybody should get. How do you navigate standing up for communities that you don't directly identify with who are facing injustices? I don't identify as white, but I acknowledge my privilege in having a white sounding name. How do you deal with white folks who want to be allies, but you don't want them to treat your issues with white saviorism? I really appreciate that question, Michelle. I also, as you can tell, am not Black, but I am very committed to Black liberation and to Black people. I am very committed to criminal justice reform and prison reform and ending police brutality and really the sanctity of Black life. And I truly believe that when Black people are free in America, we are all going to be free, and we will all have the rights that we are fighting for every day. And so the way in which I try to show up in solidarity with Black people as a person who's not Black. And of course, I'm a flawed human being. We're going to all make mistakes as we go along. It's more about the intention. I follow Black people. I show up to tables and I share my skill sets, and I share and I offer my contributions, and my Black allies and comrades will take from me what they think is going to be helpful for the movement. The idea for us as non-Black people is we should not be imposing ourselves, or we do not know better than Black people and what they need. And that's, I think, sometimes where the mistakes happen, where people come to the table and they want to put forth proposals or put forth an agenda and not really listen to the folks that are the most directly impacted. I may be impacted by other issues. I may be a member of a directly impacted community as a Muslim, but I'm not going to probably ever get shot by a police officer, or I hope none of us ever do. But that's not an issue that I'm directly impacted by. So being able to listen to Black people, listen to immigrant people if you're part of the immigrant rights movement, allowing the most directly impacted to be leading. And for sometimes in some of the movements, for us not to be doing the glamorous work. We may be the people that are bringing in the water bottle. We may be the people that are registering people at an event. We may be the people doing the kind of not visible upfront work, and that's okay, because all work and movement is important as long as we are supporting and centering the most marginalized people. You want to be the most marginalized. Hanadi's asking, when did I first know that I wanted to put myself on the front lines for the most marginalized? The first time I knew that was immediately after 9/11, when I was like 2 or 3 Fridays afterwards, I was at the mosque and these women came in crying. And they came in saying people, came to our homes and they took our husbands. One of them, it was her son. It was in this apartment building where basically law enforcement agents had raided the building and took their loved ones. And they had come to the mosque. And our imam, who's our religious leader at the time, he had just come from Egypt. He was an immigrant. He had no idea what was going on. He didn't really know what resources were available to him to help these women. And as someone who was born and raised in Brooklyn, I was an American. And I wasn't naive to injustice, but I just did not believe that law enforcement can just show up to people's house and drag their family members, and then for days they go missing and no one hears from them. And as someone who is fluent in the Arabic language, or still is fluent in the Arabic language, I was able to help these women locate their loved ones across, the abyss of law enforcement amongst in federal detention centers. And that was my radicalizing moment. I was like, I'm not going to sit back while my community is being terrorized, while my community is being connected to a horrific attack that had absolutely to do with Muslim Americans. And it really radicalized me. My aspirations were to be a high school English teacher. That's what I wanted to do. That was my whole dream. And, this is where I am now. And I came to help, to be in service to my community, to fight for civil rights for the people I love, and in hopes that getting the civil rights for the people that I love gets civil rights for everyone. And so that's why I'm here. And that was kind of my first radicalizing moment. Who had the biggest impact on my life? I think in my book, I share a lot of impact on my life. Absolutely. My parents, for sure. My parents were immigrants, came to this country from living under a military occupation in Palestine, and really came and sacrificed so that their children could live in a country where they were going to have more opportunities than my parents had when they were living in Palestine, and absolutely more than I would have had if I was born in Palestine. So definitely my parents. I also dedicated my book to a woman named Basima Atwa, who was my mentor, and she died in a terrible car accident, one that I was in as well, back in 2005. And she is the woman that really introduced me to this work and gave me the kind of confidence and courage that I have right now. So you will read a lot about her in the book, and you will unfortunately also have to read about the traumatic experience of a car accident that I never really spoke about in detail in public. And it was the first time I was really able to go through that. And that was very difficult for me as well. And of course, my mentor, Dr. Ahmed Jabed, he's an OBGYN, Dr. City. He was one of the very few male leaders that really elevated me and really encouraged me. And so I am really moved by the many people that you will read about in my book. Thoughts on the weaponization of anti-Semitism? It seems to be at a fever pitch, even against our first Jewish candidate for president. Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I do talk a little bit about the weaponization of anti-Semitism in my book. And just to be really clear, we live in a country where anti-Semitism is really at very scary levels. And the reason why it's at very scary levels is because there have been many violent attacks that have happened in the last 2 years in particular. And we're also hearing these kind of anti-Semitic, particularly dog whistles, coming from the highest offices of this land. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands that anti-Semitism, as we also talk about intersectionalities, that we can't combat anti-Black racism and Islamophobia and homophobia and xenophobia without also tackling anti-Semitism. But I also want to ensure that people understand that the criticism of the state of Israel, a state that continues the illegal military occupation of the Palestinian people, is not, for me, in my opinion, not anti-Semitism. And we cannot ever allow the critique and the valid critiques of any country, including the United States and its government. I mean, I critique the U.S. government all the time, including the President Obama. I critiqued him, and I know everybody wishes he was the president right now, but I was one of, I critiqued President Obama at the time. And so for me, weaponizing anti-Semitism takes away from the gravity of the seriousness of anti-Semitism. There are white nationalists and white supremacists who are walking into, synagogues and killing innocent worshipers, vandalizing houses of worship. So we have to be able to make a distinction between actual anti-Semitism that threatens people's lives and the challenge that many Jewish Americans, particularly those who support the state of Israel, feel. So like the question for me becomes, whether my positions on Palestine are going to harm, do my words cause harm, or are they challenging to hear? And that's the kind of important distinction that we need to make in the moment. I may be a very challenging figure, I may be controversial, but I'm not going to make you unsafe. And I think that that's something that is really important for us to understand in the moment. And of course, one last thing I'll say about that also about, Senator Sanders in particular, Senator Sanders, as you know, is a Jewish American candidate for presidency dearly, that I am one of the national surrogates, and I love him so much because he's a man of great courage, a man of deep faith, and he understands that his Jewish values tell him to stand up for the most marginalized and the most oppressed people all over the world. And he includes the Palestinian people in that. And he's being attacked not because he, of course, is anti-Semitic, because obviously he's a Jewish American. It's because of his bold stances on foreign policy. And I'm very proud of his consistency and the courage that he's showing in this moment. What do you think was the hardest social justice campaign you worked on? Two great questions. So one was what was one of the most difficult social justice campaigns I've worked on and why? I will say that one of the most difficult campaigns I worked on that we ended up actually winning was the Muslim Holidays campaign, which I do share about in the book. And it was only because of Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor, and it took us 9 years to win that campaign because Mayor Bloomberg was arrogant. He didn't give a damn about our community. He did not care about Muslim American students. He did not care about the idea of inclusion and respect for a segment of the population, the rampant bullying that was happening in the post 9/11 era. And so he really made it very difficult for us. And so that for me was a very, hard campaign. It took a lot of years, but we ended up winning it, as many people know, in 2015. Megan's asking, hey, Megan, you're amazing. I miss you so much. We're getting older. Yes, I just celebrated my 40th birthday just about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I don't even remember. I'm in quarantine or whatever you want to call it, stay at home, social distancing. So I don't even know sometimes the day of the week it is. But my birthday was on March 19th and I turned 40 years old. So I'm definitely getting old, and I'm trying to age gracefully. I don't know if I'm doing a good job. You can tell me. I am very proud of the generation that is coming up. And there is a absolutely bold, courageous, brilliant generation that is coming after us, Megan. And I'm so proud. I feel a lot of solace in my heart, knowing that as I get older, that there's going to be a lot of times where I'm going to step aside and I'm going to let the young people lead, because they are already leading us. They have something about them. They have a type of charisma. They have a very, they're unbought, they're unsold. They're just really brilliant. And I'm very proud of all the mentees and people I've worked with over the years. And many of them are leading me and I'm following them. Let me just 1 second. When did you know you wanted to wear hijab, and do you think hijab has helped you feel your full self? And so there is a very important chapter in my book called The Choice I Made, and it's about my decision to wear hijab. And hijab is, I wore 18 years old, and I wore it because I was feeling like I was missing a part of there was an identity. I was having an identity crisis. My name is Linda. I'm from Brooklyn. I have a really heavy Brooklyn accent. I have dark hair. I was growing up very ambiguous. Like I could have been Puerto Rican. I could have been a lot Italian. I could have been a whole lot of things, and no one really knew what I was. And there was something about that made me feel empty inside. And for me, hijab became a part of my identity. And it made me feel whole in a way that I hadn't felt growing up. And so that was my original reason why I wore it. I wore it more for identity purposes. And then, of course, as I grew older, I started seeing it as getting closer into my spirituality. And for me, like my hijab is almost my protection. It's something about it. It's symbolic for me, and it makes me feel proud and makes me feel courageous in ways that I really need, and I think a lot of us need right now. But I also make it very intentional in my book particularly for those who don't really know many Muslims or don't really understand hijab, that many Muslim women don't wear hijab, and that's okay. And I want folks to know that your faith is not based on a cloth that you wear. That faith is in the heart. And for me, this hijab is very important to me. It's a part of my faith, but it doesn't make me a woman that doesn't wear hijab. And, growing up in New York City, I didn't wear hijab. And of course I wore it, like I said, 1 year old, which was in 1999. And then 9/11 happened, and it became very difficult for Muslim women to wear hijab, particularly in places like New York City. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ignorance out there. There's a lot of bigotry. And sometimes people don't know how to engage their own misconceptions. And sometimes it causes unfortunate acts of violence. So we've had high rates of hate crimes that happen in the post 9/11 era that have continued to happen, particularly against those of us who are visibly Muslim. I had an incident happen to me back in 2014. Obviously, since being very visible around the Women's March, we've had these kinds of moments. But I'm never going to be intimidated. I will never decide to take my hijab off. This is a choice that I made, and it's very, very important to me. And it is also important for other young women to know that I wear this as another way and symbol to say that I am unapologetically Muslim. When I walk out of my house, you may not know I'm Palestinian. You may not know I'm from Brooklyn unless you hear me speak, but you are definitely going to know I'm Muslim, and that's very important to me. Waiting to see if there's any other folks that have any questions. This has been, and so just so folks know, in your book, you mentioned that you sent a question. So in your book, you mentioned that you get sad and question yourself when you miss your children's milestones. How do you reassure them how proud you are of them and how you are always there for them? I appreciate that question very much. In my book, hopefully you will get my book and read my book. There are moments, that I share about my son getting his first college acceptance letter and posting it on social media, and didn't really tell me about it because I was actually in Washington, D.C. It was about a few weeks before actual Women's March on Washington happened. And my son not feeling the need to tell me, basically understanding that I was doing something that he believed was historic and monumental, and saw that as such a small accomplishment based in comparison to what he thought I was organizing, and being able to have the hard conversations with my kids that I do this for them, and that I'm very proud of them, making sure I'm sending them text messages, making sure that I'm monitoring their academic achievements, that I'm following the report cards, following transcripts, and making sure they have every resource available to them. Any academic prep programs, making sure they have every book, every tool, every supply that they need, and really ensuring that they have a supportive family that's always around them. And I'm pretty sure that my children have gotten to a moment in their lives where they understand and look back at the things that I've done. And in particular, when I think about the Muslim School Holidays campaign, I was a New York City public school student, and I was one of those kids that when the Muslim holidays came around, I didn't stay home. I was the kid that wanted to go to school, and my parents thought I was crazy. And to be able to win a campaign for my own kids who are New York City public school students at the time, and to have them stay home from school, obviously my older two are in college now, but when they were all still New York City public school students, and to be able to be home on a holiday and to know that your mother was a leader of that campaign, and this campaign will go down in history and will also, as many people know, New York City is the largest public school system in the entire United States of America, and they are recognizing 2 Muslim holy holidays where 1.1 million students stay home from school in observance of this particular holiday, as we do for Christmas and Jewish holidays and Lunar New Year and other different religious holidays. And so those are the kind of things that I hope that my kids know, and I try to ensure that they know that everything that I do is for them. I want them to live in a country where they feel embraced and they feel like they can be their entire Palestinian, Muslim, Brooklyn selves all day, every day. And I want that for every child in America, which is why I'm committed to young people in particular. Young people deserve to feel loved and seen and heard, and feel like they have every opportunity at their fingertips. And I believe that we are capable and have the potential to do that as a country. So Nasreen's asking me, how did I learn English, or how did I learn how to speak English so well? Interestingly enough, Nasreen, while I was born and raised in the United States of America, people would imagine that English was my first language, but actually Arabic was my first language. Arabic was my first language because my parents were immigrants from Palestine. So they spoke to me exclusively in Arabic. And until I went around age 5, 6 is when I started learning English, and then became a fluent English speaker through the New York City public school system. And my parents, up until probably age 15, my parents were very particular about asking us to speak only in Arabic at home. because they truly believed that we should hold on to our, our native language, which was Arabic, and my parents' native language. And not only do I speak fluent Arabic, I speak a fluent dialect of Palestinian from the village that I'm from. And that was very important to my family in preservation of our heritage and culture as Palestinians. Could you talk more about your father's impact on you and your upbringing? One of the reasons why I want you to read my book is because I want you to meet Nick, AKA Nidal. My father had a very huge impact on my life, and my father is why I am who I am today. My father taught me compassion. He taught me how to support people who had less than I had. There's a lot of little anecdotes that I share about my father in the book. He was a bodega owner. I talk about the little marble composition notebooks that he had so neatly stacked up. And when one day I look at what was in there, it was all these lists of people's names, and underneath it was all these different dollar amounts, and some of them were crossed out. And it turned out that my dad was giving credit out to particular in the community, actually many Black mothers in the community, but also for Jews who lived around my father's store in Crown Heights, because there were some days where they couldn't handle money for religious reasons. And then my dad would just write whatever groceries they got. And my dad would write down a number, and then my dad would put the book away. And then I would tell my dad, like, how would you know to contact them, or when do they pay you? My father said, my customers always pay. This trust and relationship that my dad built with people that were around him, taught me the importance of relationship building, and just his compassion. He treated young people, the way he saw potential, the way he saw us, and me and my four sisters, saw us, never compared us to other boys in our family. He saw the potential in us as individuals. And for me, I talk about him in my book. He was kind of my first introduction to feminism. There was never a time where he said, you can't do something because you're a woman or a girl. Like, that just never was father's vocabulary. And so I want you to read about him. He is a huge part of my book, and I love him so much, and I'm sure you're going to love him too. I have a question about how was it growing up with 6 siblings? And so you will read a little bit more about that in my book. But I am the oldest of 7 children. So when I was 10 years old, I was already the oldest of 7. So imagine being 10 and then having 6 siblings who were younger than you. And that was my life. And so I was a born leader. I was literally leading my own organizing group from at a young age. So I share about, stories about, things that my siblings and I went through, or little anecdotes and little funny, anecdotes, having my mom had 5 daughters in a row and then 2 sons. And so you should just read about it. I promise you, it's amazing. The book is really engaging, and it's not just because I wrote it. We also have it on audiobook. And if you are yearning for a Brooklyn accent in your ear, you should definitely get my book. Nisreen, I am from Palestine. I mean, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, but my parents are Palestinian, and they are from a village called El Bire, which I do write about also in my book. Karen, hi Karen. I hope to see you very soon. Karen's asking me, how did you feel about the white women in pink hats who showed up for the 2017 Women's March? I do share a little bit about the white women in the pink hats in the book. My reaction to the white women in the pink hats was I welcomed them with open arms. And the reason why I welcomed them with open arms is that initially, the minute I saw the pink hats, I knew that many of these women this was their first time organizing. It was their first time coming to a march. And they told us that. A lot of them told us they never marched a day in their lives up until that Women's March on Washington. And so I knew that they had a lot to learn, and I was invested in helping them to be on that journey and to follow women of color and organizers who've been doing this work for a long time. And I think overall, many of these white women have come along, and many of them have went back to their communities and have invested in working with, refugee organizations, working with immigrant rights organizations, working on local electoral work, helping to elect more women to Congress and to local level offices. So I've definitely seen progress, and I've seen a trajectory that we've been needing for a long time in this. But I also saw the downfalls, and I saw the holes that still need especially on the relationship between women of color and white women in particular. The idea of sharing power and, and white women giving up some of the power and some of the, women of color to take lead and to kind of be at the forefront. And that's been a struggle. Also, the white women oftentimes come to the movements without an intersectional lens. They also come to the movement with a lack of knowledge on particularly global issues. So they don't see the connection between why a woman like me, who is a daughter of Palestinian immigrants, how do I make the connection between social justice and human rights in America with the social justice and human rights, for example, of Palestinians? And that makes people feel uncomfortable. So white women come to the table with a lot of exceptionalism, this idea of a better version, of course, than the right, with this idea of America first, but from the perspective of we should help here domestically. We should be working and focusing only on domestic issues. And for me, I'm a global activist. I believe that our liberation as Americans is tied up and bound with the liberation of people all over the world. And I'm not going to cut those ties or change my theory of change about liberation to make white women feel comfortable. And unfortunately, I have been a very uncomfortable figure for white women. I don't know what else to say about that. And I'm very grateful for women like you, Karen, and the many women like Alethea and so many other women I've met on Bob Bland and many, many others, and Brianne and Sophie and so many other white women who have really stepped up in this movement to educate other white women and to kind of work in close relationship with women of color. You talk about restorative justice. This is from Madiha. You talk about restorative justice and how you came to see that practice. For instance, how your Yaba practiced it. Could you give some insight on how restorative justice can be weaved into community literacy education? I really appreciate that, Madiha. Restorative justice is a concept that we've heard often, and it's used in different contexts, whether that means restorative justice from the perspective of our criminal justice reform movement, restorative justice from the perspective of the movement. So, for example, when there's conflict between two movement organizers or movement organizations, restorative justice could also mean when there's an issue with children, like in a classroom or in the education system. It could also be meaning your children, your own children that you had at home, and how when someone does something that quote unquote is wrong, how do we then bring people back into a space where we don't demonize them and vilify them and criminalize them, but actually give them an opportunity to kind of put forth a more oriented process that kind of looks at solutions to undo harm that was done without making the person who did the harm be the bad person, right? Because that person, there are many reasons why people do harm. And sometimes we have to take people on a journey to understand how that harm was caused. So I think that there are great resources that I can't share off the top of my head right now, but there are definitely resources where we can put into the kind of organizing work we're already doing in our local communities, in adult education programs, and of course, really in our larger education system about weaving this idea of restorative justice into the ways in which we interact with those around us. Christopher is asking, what was your initial idea cover for the book? So the book looks like this, and it has my big face on it. And the original, I really wanted a picture of a protest. And I thought that was so predictable. And I think my editor pretty predictable. I wanted to have a picture of a protest with Muslim women on it. But then I understand, and I did believe that this was the way to go. And, I thought about walking into a bookstore and having young people walk into a bookstore, particularly young Muslim women walking into a bookstore like a Barnes & Noble, like an independent store, like Booksmith or Busboys and Poets or The Strand, or Uncle Bobby's in Philadelphia, and seeing a picture and seeing a book that looks like this, where there is a Muslim woman who's proud with dignity. And the title of my book is We Are Not Here to Be Bystanders. And I think the book is very powerful. It has a kind of classic look to it. But I thought the representation right now in this moment for all of us was really important. So that's kind of how we got to this particular book cover. And of course, in the back of the book, when you get the book, you will get really cute pictures. This is my dad and my granny and me. And this is a picture of me and some of my siblings. That's me in The Simpsons with my baby brother. And that is me up there. I had that like 80s Farrah Fawcett haircut going on. Me and my sisters, that's me again up there. And then this is my uncle, may God rest his soul. And that's little me with the pigtails and my cousin. So I got some little baby photos of me in the back. Yeah, that's a great question. What do I feel about social distancing, since I am someone who never social distances ever, who's out there streets, always on the streets? So I think that's an important question in this moment. We have a little bit of time left. I'm an organizer. I'm a door knocker. I'm the lady that knocks on your door to talk to you about issues, to get you to vote for someone, or to get you to support a campaign I'm working on. I'm with people all day long, every day. I mobilize, I organize, I do phone banking, I do all kinds of stuff. And so for me, it's been very difficult. I've had very difficult moments. I'm actually was really excited about doing this virtual event, believe it or not. You know why? So I can put a hijab on and put some lipstick on. I've been literally sitting at home, working off my computer, and it's just not who I am. I want to be outside with the people. That's who I am. I'm a people person. People give me energy. And when I meet people, every single person that I meet, every story that I hear, even if it's a sad story, it re-energizes me for the work. So I feel really sad that I'm not out and not organizing, but I'm also looking forward to what organizing is going to look like. I hope that everybody has been radicalized by this pandemic. I feel like this has been a wake-up call for all of us of what we know our country has been capable of without being able to, all the things we've been fighting for: healthcare, fighting for housing the homeless, being able to give people some sort of economic stimulus, and all these things we've been fighting for. And here we are, being able to do all these things and finding, and no one saying how we're going to pay for that. I hope people are radicalized. So I'm really right now sitting home strategizing about what my organizing work is going to look like immediately after we get out of this pandemic. And I promise you that I'm going to be a louder, more strategic organizer than I ever was before, that this pandemic really shined a light on the true and deepest injustices of this country, and how those that are in power have actually a lot more power than we know, than we say or believe that they have. And they showed us that during this pandemic. They also showed us that they don't believe or care about the sanctity of life, and that our president fumbled the lives of Americans and those of us some of us who are undocumented. I mean, Americans for me are everybody who lives on this land. So that's I'm sad, but I'm also hopeful and looking forward to the world post the pandemic. This is a great question that I'm going to kind of end this on and get back to our Booksmith friends and see if they have anything to kind of round this out with. But the question is, how does someone not be a bystander? Let me quickly tell you where I got this title from. This is a title that I got. These are my words, and I used them at a CUNY commencement speech that I did back in 2017, where I honored the lives of three men. These three men in Oregon were on a train, and what happened was there was a white man who was threatening a Black woman and her Muslim friend, and pretty much accosting them. And these three men came in to basically intervene. They were like, we're not going to be bystanders in this situation. And what happened was, unfortunately, was this man had a knife and he stabbed them. And two of the men actually lost their lives that day. One young man, Micah Fletcher, who was a poet, young progressive poet, lived to tell the story. And I'm grateful to God that at least one of them was able to live. This young man who had a beautiful, bright future ahead of them, all of them did. One of them was a father, had daughters, and just the whole situation was so sad. And so for me, this book is about, what does it mean not to be a bystander? And of course, in this book, I'm very clear about saying that I don't want you to ever put yourself in physical harm, because that's important to me. But all of us have been in situations where we've had colleagues, or we've had family members, or we've seen injustice happening, or we've seen someone do something racist, or we've seen someone do something that we know is wrong. And the idea is that we are not there to be bystanders, that we are there to step in, to intervene, to say something, to do something. Right now we're in this global pandemic. What does it mean not to be a bystander right now? And not being a bystander means to take this seriously and sit yourself at home and try to help flatten this curve. That, in fact, believe it or not, is another way of not being a bystander to this injustice that's happening right now. It also means when there is a hurricane. We had a big hurricane in New York, Hurricane Sandy. What does that mean as neighbors to get up and go help our neighbors? You know, when there is a hurricane or there's a tornado, what does it mean when a young Black man is killed at the hands of police? What does it mean for us to go to our local communities and stand up and say, we're going to show up and we're not going to be bystanders? That's what it means when someone's healthcare is being stripped, when a mother in our community is being deported. What does it mean for us to get up and say, we are not going to be bystanders. We're going to show up. We're going to donate. We're going to sign a petition. We're going to vote. We're going to go to the border. We're going to collect, gifts and items for the kids at the border. We're going to demand our elected officials release the children, whatever is the issue, whatever the thing that's happening around you. We cannot just sit back and say, this is wrong. The next step is to say, I'm not going to be a bystander to this. So the first step is just acknowledging when something's an injustice. And the second step is saying, I'm not going to be a bystander. I'm going to get up and do something. And the last example that I'll give also that's really important to me as a Muslim American, I talk a little bit about this in the book, but 77 years ago, something really horrible happened in our country, and it was a Japanese internment. So 77 years ago wasn't that long ago. And one of the reasons why that particular event in our history, and there have been many atrocities, as you know, in this country, but that particular atrocity speaks to me deeply as a Muslim American. 77 years ago, we said that the Japanese were not to be trusted, that the Japanese were the enemies within, that the Japanese were not capable of being loyal to this country, and that the government at the time built the propaganda campaign to the point where the American public overall really sat back idly and allowed that to happen. We interned Japanese Americans on this US soil, including babies that went with their parents to camps. One of those is former Congressman Mike Honda, who's actually still alive today. And the reason why that resonates with me is that all these years later in 2020, we hear the same things said about the Muslims. Muslims are incapable of being loyal to this country. Islam and the Constitution are incompatible, that Muslims are the enemies within, that we have some sort of loyalty to some foreign entities across the world. And it's actually been a narrative that has been used against myself, Ilhan, Rashida, and many other powerful Muslim American women in this country. And so what I say to people all the time that deciding not to be a bystander is saying, I'm not going to accept misinformation. I'm not going to be a bystander to fake news, as our president calls it. And that I'm going to stand up for Muslim Americans. I'm going to stand up for Muslim communities. I'm going to stand up for refugees. I'm going to stand up when when it says we're going to ban the Muslims, I'm going to stand up and say, not on my watch as an American. When the country says we're not going to accept refugees fleeing terrorism, we're going to stand up and say that is not our America. We will accept refugees. We will stand up for the sanctity of Black life, that those who are to protect and serve should be protecting and serving all of us. And all these different injustices are connected. And so what I say to people is, when you say never again, that requires for you first to make a decision that you're not going to be a bystander. Never again is not a magical thing where things are just like, bad things are never going to happen. Bad things will always happen. And the only time that we can stop bad things from happening is when good people get up and say, I'm not going to be a bystander to injustice. So I promise you that this book will give you the type of inspiration that you need in this moment. We all need a pick-me-upper. I promise you the book is not a sad book. The book is not about I'm a victim to like racism in America and I'm this poor little Muslim lady. It's actually quite the opposite of all of that. And it actually gives you, I think, a blueprint that's going to get you thinking about what are you going to be ready to do the day after they say the pandemic has been contained, we got this under control, you can now stop social distancing. I hope that the first thing that you decide to do is find your congressman's office and go protest outside of it, because that's exactly what I'm going to do when I'm out of here. So thank you to Booksmith. Please support Booksmith. Send them a donation. They're accepting donations on PayPal. What I will say is that people know me very well. Like, I have a Kindle. I do all that too, because my brother bought it for me. But I actually only buy physical books. My house is full of books because I love bookstores. I can sit in bookstores for hours and hours and hours and forget that I was there for those many hours. And a lot of our bookstores are struggling across the country. Many of them have had to close their doors because of this pandemic. And some of them are in fear of potentially never being able to reopen. So in the meantime, whatever extra money you have, even if you already have all the books that you want, you don't have to buy a book. Just drop a donation to bookstores like Booksmith. I'm going to do that right now. And I just want to say I appreciate all the work that you do, and thank you for having me today.